we've already learned about these two things, which we're going to learn about a little bit more in this video. Internet and the World Wide Web. We are going to look at the technology, which we've already talked about, so we're going to review that makes up the internet. We're going to look at the technology that makes up the internet. We're also going to look at cloudware, review that, and just make sure you know that term. So you're going to learn two things in this video. You're going to learn about the technology, the hardware that makes up the internet, and you're also going to learn about cloudware. Just we're going to review that term, make sure you know what that is. So there's a lot of technology involved in making up the internet, but some of the primary stuff, right? Some of the primary stuff, let's take a look at it. What have we learned so far about networks, actually? A network is two or more devices connected together, and the benefits of a network is they allow us to share information and share resources. And you know, if we're going to connect a network, we need to connect that network with either wires or wirelessly. And so if we're going to connect with wires, so now we're talking about the network, which is the internet. What kind of wires are out there on the internet? And you know, basically all the wires we've already talked about with networking, those are also used, right? Since they're used with networking, they're used to comprise part of the internet. So Ethernet Cat5, Ethernet Cat6, you know, coaxial cable, you know, fiber optic cable. Sometimes you'll hear about backbones of the internet. Like that's a backbone of the internet. That's an internet backbone. And often all that means is it's a really big installation of cables, fiber optic cables, for moving a lot of data between two locations. So like, you know, there's a backbone that goes up and down the San Joaquin Valley where I live, you know, connecting us with San Francisco and Los Angeles. And that's just so data can move really quickly. It's just fiber optic cables. So we got fiber optic cables, we've got Ethernet cables, we've got coaxial cables. Pretty much all of the telecommunications infrastructure, all of the cable TV infrastructure, like all of that is used as part of, well, not all of it, but you know, that infrastructure is utilized to a certain extent, a large extent, to build the internet, to be part of the internet. I'm not quite saying that right. Right, but that's some of the hardware that makes up the internet. It's just using the telecommunication, the cable television infrastructure to move data. We also use satellite communications, right? That's part of the telecommunication industry and you know, voice communications before we had the internet. And so satellites are part of that. So that's using connections and using wired or wireless connections. And then all the things we talked about with networking. We talked about routers, and we talked about hubs, switches, and routers. We talked about hubs, switches, and routers. And so those are some of the components that are used also to make up the internet. And yeah, so we already saw what routers do, right? But routers route traffic around on the internet. So here's a couple of slides that I found online, which I think are interesting to look at. So we already talked about IP addresses and why they're important. Here you can see a hub connecting different machines. That might also be a switch. And then here you see different computers being connected. And here's a campus mainframe connecting to the internet. And this person's dialing in on a phone line. You could do it that way. Here we have a repeater, a bridge, a router, and a gateway. And so these are just different things for connecting networks. A repeater will repeat a signal. So if you're having to go a long distance, the repeater will be put in between the distance to make sure the signal sustains itself over the full length. And so a repeater repeats a signal. A bridge allows you to connect you know, various locations. So a bridge bridges two networks. That's what it is. A bridge bridges two networks. So let's say there's two buildings, or here we got two buildings here, and we got two buildings here, and then we're going to send a message. The message goes out, and the bridge determines, does the message stay right here with these two buildings, or does it go all the way across campus over to these two buildings? So the bridge helps decide between these various networks, where is this message going? And then a router does that on a larger scale, right? So bridge is somewhat like a router, bridging two networks in a smaller area. And then a router routes messages. And finally, a gateway will allow you to connect networks with different protocols. Well, that's just some of the hardware that's out there. And then we learned about routing. We learned about name servers and the DNS, domain name system, right? We've talked about transmission speed some, though this one lays it out really nicely. 300 bits to 28 kilobits per second, 56 kilobits per second, T1, T3. So these are just some of the different speeds that are out there. Wide area connection. Yeah, so that's some of the stuff that is out there about the technology. So technology involved. TCP/IP, right? Protocols. We talked about protocols and rules of communication. HTTP, FTP, file transfer protocol. TCP/IP. I spelled that wrong. TCP/IP, transmission control protocol, internet protocol, packet switching. Absolutely, you need to know what packet switching is. Routers, client server, and peer-to-peer architecture. Right. So that's some of the primary stuff involved, and you should know all that stuff. Right, so protocols, rules of communication, how people talk, packet switching versus circuit switch networks, routers, which we've talked about, client-server architecture versus the peer-to-peer architecture. So all that stuff, that's some of the technology involved, some of the hardware involved in making up the internet. And cloudware, finally, it could also be known as an application service provider. It could also be known as a web service. It could also be known as cloudware. It could be known as web-based software. It could be known, also known as, aka just software as a service, right? So these are all different names for cloudware where your application is running in the cloud, kind of like with Google Drive, right? I go into Google Drive and yeah, I go into Google Drive and I can create a document or a presentation or a spreadsheet like this one, and that's all running in the cloud. So those are just two concepts. They're a review for us. But I just wanted to make sure they're covered when we're talking about the internet and the World Wide Web to make sure that you know about these two things. Very good.